Now, today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is historian Alan MacEachern. He is a history professor at the University of Western Ontario and is speaking today about a fire that occurred about 200 years ago that is still having an impact on Canada and the United States today. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Alan.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I'm going to be talking today about an 1825 fire. I asked Jamie when he asked me to come talk to you today. I suggested he should wait for the bicentennial and we'll make a really big deal of it, but he insisted that he'll have me back in 2025 as well. Anyway, thanks for the Forest History Society for having me today, and thank you, Jamie, and thank all of you for coming out today. So what am I going to talk about? My argument today is going to be that borders matter except when they don't. The past few years has offered, I think, pretty clear evidence of that. COVID-19 swept across the globe, unconcerned with political boundaries, and yet different nations, even different states, different provinces, responded differently to the coronavirus, developing homegrown policies to repel it from their borders and, once inside, to contain it. And they saw different levels of infection and death from one political jurisdiction to another. So nature and culture were together defining our experience with COVID. And this dual nature of borders as both mattering and not mattering can be seen in historic cases as well. On the 7th of October, 1825, a massive wildfire swept across the British North American colony of New Brunswick, destroying communities along the Miramichi River here. Here's New Brunswick, and here's the Miramichi region, killing at least 160 people. When the smoke cleared, this true scale of the disaster became better known. Early reports estimated, and virtually every account over the following generation confirmed, that the Miramichi fire had burned about 6,000 square miles, about 4 million acres of northeastern New Brunswick. Basically, let's say this big area here, 1/5 of the colony of New Brunswick. But the fire was not only burning in New Brunswick. The same day, an estimated 1,300 square miles, more than 800,000 acres of central Maine also caught fire. Maine, of course, is here, and the area where it's known to have burned was through the center, making this what is still the most extensive forest fire in the state's history. So together, the fires of October 7, 1825 are some of the largest in recorded North American history, certainly the largest ever recorded along the eastern seaboard of North America. Not surprisingly, the historical memory of the 1825 fires in the two neighboring jurisdictions became linked, but not ever in a straightforward fashion. For example, the fire in Maine also became known as the Miramichi fire. So it became used by, the name became used by Canadian and American writers to refer to the fire in both New Brunswick and Maine, or just New Brunswick, or even sometimes just in Maine. And in those latter two cases, often with no apparent knowledge that the fire burned across the international border. And yet, the 6,000 square mile figure has become the default estimate of the fire's extent when discussing it in New Brunswick alone, and also in the two together. So, for example, in George Perkins Marsh's 1864 classic Man and Nature, often considered the first book to chronicle humans' effects on nature, Marsh uses the 6,000 square mile figure. What does he say? The Great Fire of Miramichi in 1825, probably the most extensive and terrific conflagration recorded in authentic history, spread its ravages over nearly 6,000 square miles. So maybe he's referring strictly to New Brunswick, but he was living in Burlington, Vermont at the time. He knew about the fires in Maine as well as New Brunswick. He smelled their intermingled smoke in 1825. I first heard about the Miramichi fire in Marsh's book, actually, and I look forward to reading more about it, especially as a Canadian reading about this American talking about this maritime Canada fire. But that turned out to be difficult. Although it was one of the most famous natural disasters of the 19th century, it all but disappeared in the 20th century. The most sustained historical analysis of the disaster in the past 2 centuries that I could find was 9 pages long. So I wrote this. It's a work of environmental history, but it's also about social memory of how topics of environmental history can be forgotten because the nature itself on which they occur change. So I traced the history of the Miramichi fire on both sides of the international border as a means of demonstrating how the border distorted understanding of the broader event. Because Maine suffered less devastation than New Brunswick and no known deaths, its experience of the fire has always been overshadowed by that of its northern neighbors. But because Canada has in turn long been overshadowed by the United States, I'll admit it, nowhere more so than in the United States, the Miramichi fire has received less attention than comparable strictly American disasters, such as the 1871 Peshtigo fire, which was in size probably less than 1/3 of the reported size of the 1825 fire in New Brunswick alone. In essence, the international border served as a kind of cultural firebreak, dispersing the blaze and diminishing its fame. So for the next little while, I'm going to work to convince you of that. I'm going to focus my efforts on the Maine side of the border, not just because I'm guessing that some or most of you are American, but also because the understanding and memory of the fire is strangest in Maine, I'm going to argue, and demonstrates most clearly, I'd argue, the international border's effects. I'm going to talk about how the border defined 4 things: the fire's timing, the international relief effort, fire's presumed range, its cause, and the fire's range. Now, you might ask, why this chronology? Why not go in the fire's own chronological order? First the cause, then the timing and range, and then the relief effort. And my answer is because the way the fire became understood and was remembered, all of that happened only in retrospect. And this order better represents how that happened. Okay, I'm going to start with timing. The Miramichi fire is always dated to October 7th, 1825, to the day when the fires poured down on the communities on the Miramichi, leaving thousands homeless, and fires scorched Maine as well. But the fires had started well before that in Maine. The summer of 1825 was one of the hottest, if not the hottest, of the 19th century in northeastern North America. Let me go back a decade. This came at the end of an unusually cool decade. The 1815 eruption of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia had spread a cloud of ash and dust throughout the global atmosphere, making the late 1810s the single coldest period of the Little Ice Age. The cool, wet weather of the late 1810s checked forest fires and allowed combustible vegetation to accumulate, producing perfect conditions for an eventual conflagration. In the heat of the summer of 1825, fires blazed in patches all the way from Lake Superior to Nova Scotia. So by August 1825, there were already reports of fires throughout the south central heart of Maine. Let me try to find where this happened. In communities from Boydentown down here along the coast to up in Bangor in the east. In the words of an account from Norridge Walk, west of Bangor in Somerset County, quote, "In every town and on almost every farm for some weeks past, the woods have presented one continued sheet of fire and devastation. The only thing that could check the fire, according to that same newspaper, was, quote, what we have not seen for a long time, a good, wholesome, soaking rain." So that was in August. The rain didn't come. And on September 8th, a Bangor reporter, writing as fire ran through his town, told of a 30-mile sea of fire burning along both sides of the Penobscot River. Newspapers reported that fires blazed in communities throughout, I'm going to be very rough here, in Somerset County, in Piscataquis County, and in Penobscot County, in the central and northern Maine. Fires were said to be more extensive than ever known, but they were defined almost exclusively in terms of the individual towns they threatened, not a more general range. So this was all late August, early September. Then the fire season went quiet. But a month later, on October 7th, Maine and New Brunswick were hit with the remnants of a hurricane coming up the coast. The winds meant that smoldering fires flared up all over, worse than ever. A ship's captain sailing off Portland, Maine, reported burning far north toward Penobscot. There was news that the countryside was on fire for 100 miles. A whole series of communities throughout counties in the center of the state were listed repeatedly in the press as having suffered badly. Yet the nature of Maine's suffering was fundamentally different than what New Brunswick was facing. Consider a newspaper account of how the fire had entered Bangor on October 7th. The article describes experiences identical to those being experienced in the Miramichi on the same day. The high winds shifting suddenly to the west and northwest as presumably a storm front, a hurricane passed over, flames bursting suddenly out of the woods. But the author concluded, quote, "But the most distressing part of our relation is yet to come. 12 buildings with most of their content were totally destroyed. Just 12 buildings. The main fires resulted in the loss of pine and property, but not persons. So when word reached the wider world of the much more extensive damage that occurred in the Miramichi region of New Brunswick on the very same day, the wiping out of entire communities, the killing of hundreds, the Maine disaster was quickly eclipsed. As a result, there was actually less content in the North American press that fall about Maine's October 7th fires than there had been about the fires that had burned in Maine throughout August and September. And yet, in public memory, it's Maine's August and September fires that have been completely forgotten. The total range of those fires have been lumped together with the fires of October 7th. Okay, that's the first way that the border shaped things a little wonkily, if wonkily is a word, and it certainly should be. The second is, I'm going to turn to the relief effort. The international border also shaped the responses of people who learned of the forest fires that autumn. News of the fire as experienced in New Brunswick and the fact that it had left hundreds dead, thousands homeless on the eve of a Canadian winter excited sympathy and generosity across the Western world. An impressive international relief effort was born, and this image is from the charity pamphlet produced and distributed all across North America and Europe. And Americans were notably generous, by the way. Spurred by newspapers' publication of subscription lists, a competition arose among major US cities to see which would give the most. Quote, "Boston had done most nobly, and Philadelphia has taken the field," a New York newspaper noted, but was happy to report that its own city had raised almost $4,000 in a single day. 35 Boston churches collected money for the Miramichi region. A ship from Boston took 2 trips to Halifax with provisions. Besides food, clothing, and supplies, Americans sent at least $20,000 in cash to the British colony. Now, this is only a decade after the two nations have fought the War of 1812, and while they were still disputing the Maine-New Brunswick border, the American relief effort was frequently promoted as a way to confirm and fortify America's close relationships with Great Britain and its colonies. But it should be noted, the Boston ship that sailed to Halifax did not stop on the way in Maine to help victims of the fires in Maine. Although there were people in Maine who had lost property, who had been left homeless, no charity drive was ever organized to help them recover. The scope of the disaster in the Miramichi region simply eclipsed that in Maine. Even residents of Eastport, Maine, well aware that forest fires had wreaked havoc in their own state, raised $400 to help survivors in New Brunswick. New Brunswickers were very grateful for the American relief effort, by the way, both for the aid itself and for what it suggested about relationships between the two countries. In 1827, somebody wrote to a Maine newspaper complaining that no American working in New Brunswick at the time of the fire had been allowed to share in the compensation in the charity. The colony's relief committee was so outraged by this base calumny, I love that phrase, that it published a handbill of Americans who had received relief. Okay, I've talked about the timing. I've talked about the relief effort. Now I'm going to turn to the fire's cause. In the weeks immediately after the fire, the focus was on the suffering. But with relief efforts underway, talk soon turned to what might have caused the fires. The answers were very different on the two sides of the international border. In New Brunswick, since the fire had swept west to east across the colony, from the largely unsettled interior of the colony towards the more settled coast, There was really no way of determining its original cause, to know what had happened in the interior to have caused this fire. It didn't prevent commentators from casting blame. Some thought it was likely lumbermen burning slash, others thought settlers clearing farmland, others suspect the carelessness of indigenous people. Still others pinned the fire on natural causes such as lightning or spontaneous combustion, or the earth having been brushed by the tail of a comet. But in Maine, there was much more pointed blame. Throughout the summer of 1825, Maine and Massachusetts had sent land agents throughout Maine's northern interior in search of unlicensed logging operations. They often found cut meadow hay near such sites. The hay was fodder for the lumber poachers' draft animals, and as such, it was fuel for the whole enterprise. So the land agents burned this hay on the hottest summer on record. So here is land agent James Irish defending the practice that fall. I'm going to read from the second paragraph. The hay was accordingly destroyed, and the agent is happy to say without occasioning any damage or loss to public or private property, and has in a good degree had the desired effect. Does it seem at all like maybe he's protesting too much? Because even before Irish wrote this in mid-September, after the state's first wave of fires, a letter had appeared in a Bangor newspaper, purportedly from Penobscot Indigenous leader John Neptune, accusing Irish and his man Ezekiel Chase, a captain in the Revolutionary War, of causing the fires that had devastated the state. Neptune is said to have written, "What Meanham state agents send Captain Chase to Burnham hay when everything's so dry? Indian 2 township all burn up before rain come. Indian lost all timber and hay. When Indian have all timber and hay, nobody burn hay. Now state get all Indian land, but 2 township, then he set fire to drive all Indian off." This was in September that Neptune is writing this. So after October 7th, this accusation spread to include the fire of that day as well. White squatters in eastern Maine blamed the state's agents for setting the blaze, not to displace indigenous people in this case, but to disrupt their timber operations. In reality, the land agents had an alibi for October 7th. They were in Maine. They were right at the border between Maine and New Brunswick at that on the day of the fire. The wind and fire was coming from the west, so there's absolutely no way they could have started fires that burned much farther west in the state on that day. But the idea that the state's own officials had caused the state's worst fires was so delicious that it became woven into public memories. So you can read it here, as seen here in this 1882 History of Penobscot County. Like so much about the Miramichi fire, it is impossible to know the truth for sure, whether a small fire set by government officials in August or September caused or even contributed to any of the fires that bedeviled Maine that year. But what's most striking to me is that though the Maine agents have been blamed in Maine, no one writing in or about the New Brunswick fire in either contemporary or subsequent accounts over the past 2 centuries has ever pointed at Maine's land agents as the culprit for the New Brunswick fire. This, although Maine is to New Brunswick's west, although the winds and the fire were traveling from west to east, there's certainly opportunity to have blamed the Maine land agents. That's never happened. The border was a firebreak, too formidable for blame to jump it. Okay, I'm going to circle back now to my fourth discussion of the fire's range. Once it was understood that Maine and New Brunswick had each experienced massive forest fire events on the very same day, it's little wonder that people assumed that the 2 fires must be connected. They were not, in effect, fires at all, but they were a single fire. In the words of one Nova Scotia newspaper article that fall, quote, "This devastating element hurried through the wildernesses of Maine on the Atlantic and swept onwards on the blast of the hurricane until stayed by the waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence." It became routine in early accounts to mention the fires in Maine as a way of showing the scope of the disaster. But the death and destruction along the Miramichi fire utterly overshadowed what happened elsewhere. As a result, no writer of the day attempted to map the fire's path between Maine and New Brunswick. The closest anyone came to trying was a writer by the name of, he went by the name W, in a series for a Miramichi newspaper, The Gleaner, 6 years later in 1831. W was himself a survivor of the Great Fire, and he traced reports of its route backwards. See if I can show you this from the Miramichi. He traces it all the way back to the border, to the colony's extreme southwest corner, right on Maine's doorstep. W was actually the Gleaner's own reporter, Robert Cooney, who published a history of northern New Brunswick the following year in 1832. In that book, Cooney didn't trace the fire back to Maine. He focused strictly on the Miramichi component of the blaze. And why did he do so? He did it so that he could position the fire as the defining event in the history of northern New Brunswick. He was successful, so much so that for the next 2 centuries, his book has been the most quoted material on the fire. So ironically, the writer who came closest to connecting New Brunswick fire to Maine was also the writer who, more than anyone, solidified the Miramichi fire's range as principally occurring on the Miramichi. In the course of my research, I mapped everywhere I could find, everywhere there were reports of fire throughout northern forest fires throughout northeastern North America that late summer and fall of 1825. This is from my book. So as you can see, there are fires going on that summer and fall, not just in Maine and New Brunswick, but also major fires that burned in Gaspé, in Nova Scotia, in Vermont, and around Montreal. Actually, the Montreal ones I think are particularly interesting because remarkably, its fires of fall 1825, would be remembered for the rest of the 19th century as the Miramichi fire. So here we are, even 60 years later, they're referring to these fires in Montreal as the Miramichi fire, even though the Miramichi is, 1,000 kilometers away. In New Brunswick, the reports of fire were focused on the colony's northeast. In Maine, they were focused in the state's center. That is how history has come to understand these fires. I'm going to mention these 2 maps. New Brunswick geographer W.F. Ganong, he makes this map, which I've superimposed on a map of New Brunswick, and he sees it right as happening mostly in the northeast corner of the colony. Maine historian Charles Fobe in 1948, he describes the 1825 fires as here right in the center. So historically, these 1825 fires have been understood as distinct, separate fires. So for example, in the late 1800s, Maine forester Austin Carey noted that though the blaze in the state was named for a Canadian location, the Canadian was, quote, a different fire, being separated from the other for many miles. Or in the mid-20th century, American historian Stuart Holbrook downplayed the 1825 fire as, quote, a Canadian fire, but then discussed it solely in terms of its impact on Maine. Modern-day fire historian Stephen J. Pine is highly unusual in writing about the fire on both sides of the international border, but notably he does so separately in 2 distinct histories of American and of Canadian forest fires. What I argue in my book is the belief that in such discrete Maine and New Brunswick fires is more likely a product of reporting than of reality. There is a lovely 1829 map by cartographer Moses Greenleaf showing the northern spread of settlement of Maine after the American Revolution. In this map, blue refers to settlement that occurred up to 1800, pink up to 1810, and yellow up to 1820. If you superimpose reported 1825 fire locations on that map by Greenleaf, you can see that most of the reported burns in Maine occurred in settled territory, and that there were relatively few reports of fire beyond. And that is only to be expected for 2 reasons. The first, land clearing, timber cutting, wood heating, cooking, and all the other trappings of human settlement increase the potential for fires to get out of hand. Generally speaking, where there are fewer people, there are fewer fires. But second, places that are more settled, particularly those with newspapers, are more likely to record their experiences. Generally speaking, where there are fewer people, there are fewer reports of fires. Since the entire region between Maine and New Brunswick's fire zones, this area here, was sparsely populated and had no newspapers, we may reasonably wonder if fire burned parts of it or just went unreported. In fact, if you draw a straight line from Montreal to the Miramichi through Maine, it passes through some of the least populated parts of northeastern North America then and now. Fires could well have burned there in 1825 and gone unreported, which of course is not proof that they did, but we may reasonably wonder if two massive fires that burned in the same environmental and climatic conditions on the very same day, less than 200 kilometers apart, were not in fact connected. To conclude, like water beating on a surface, natural disasters, and perhaps all historical events, undergo a process of spatial and temporal consolidation as they move into the past. Boundaries become firmer. But because the Miramichi fire was centered in two distinct core areas, central Maine and northeastern New Brunswick, and especially because these were on two sides of an international border, the areas drew apart and consolidated separately. The fact that the fire resulted in far more deaths and damage on the Canadian side meant it became known by a Canadian name. Rather than sharing memory of this natural disaster, both nations lost track of its dimensions on the other side of the border, diminishing its memory on both sides. In the early 21st century, the American Red Cross's website, disasterrelief.org, offered information about historical natural disasters. Its list of historical forest fires began as most lists of historical forest fires do, with the 1825 blaze. There was even a helpful accompanying map, this one here, with Maine singled out, and New Jersey, because presumably the site's creators mistakenly believed that a fire that torched the state of Maine and the neighboring British colony of New Brunswick had instead torched Maine and the town of New Brunswick, New Jersey. This error seems a fitting illustration of how the Miramichi fire, a forest fire that joined two nations, has been simultaneously remembered and forgotten. Thank you for your attention today, and I most certainly welcome your questions.
Thanks, Alan. You're right that at the end there with how the American Red Cross crossed their wires, if you will, and you're right, that encapsulates a lot. Just a reminder to folks, if you want to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A forum, not the chat. I do want to note, Andrew Stillman says in the chat, though, that Eastport, Maine was part of New Brunswick up until 1811, from 1783 to 1811. Can you talk a little bit about the border dispute? Or is that something within your purview, and is it relevant to this talk?
It's certainly relevant in terms of, the fuzziness of the border and the idea, I think, at that moment that folks on this disputed border, mostly in the northern part of New Brunswick, the northern part of Maine, were trying to get as much timber as possible, as quickly as possible, because they knew that this border, that when this all shook down, that they might end up being on the wrong side of the international border. So there was all this more reason to get the timber out right then. And this was, certainly from a New Brunswick perspective, this was after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1810s. This was a real boom time for timber in New Brunswick, and it was a boom time for timber in Maine as well. So certainly there's no smoking gun for this fire. There's no idea of what exactly caused it, but certainly the fact that there's a lot of timber activity going on at that moment is perhaps one of the reasons, or one of the factors causing it. To me, one of the factors, some of the factors have nothing to do with it. The fact that Tambora, that a volcano erupted 10 years earlier, that had been an extremely cool late 1810s and early 1820s, and then 1825 is the hottest year of the century. Those are just as much factors as anything kind of momentary that happens that might have caused the fire.
Okay. Steve Ambrose asks if you found any information on what types of tools they use to fight fires.
It was very minimal. In fact, it was better in Maine. That was one of the things that I found, that settlement was, because I presume because settlement was a little bit further along in central Maine than it was in eastern New Brunswick at that point, that they were more familiar with fires, and they were more, so they were doing things like trying to pour water on their roofs. They were burying goods, and like in preparation. They were trying to create kind of rough fire breaks, and towns were just at that very moment starting to deal with creating fire services. None of this was really happening quite yet in eastern New Brunswick, which is one of the problems. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is that all these folks, 90% of the settlers of eastern New Brunswick at that moment are recent immigrants from Great Britain who have no familiarity with the forests of Canada, let alone with forest fires. So they really are not developing that. They really have no expertise, no expectation of what a forest fire in Canada could look like.
That's certain, coming from a fire-free environment to one where it's a definite threat. Certainly would leave you unprepared if you weren't walking into an existing knowledge base.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, there was a certain, I mean, as you know, there's kind of a certain sense that, well, a few things. So there's a sense that trees are pretty much worthless. Individual trees are worthless. That we've got to burn a lot of trees to clear land. We've got to burn a lot of trees just to make room to cut other trees down. And there's a feeling that, what are you going to do? That fires happen. There's no way of prevention. And I mean, there's so many cases in the early 19th century. You read accounts from the early 19th century, and people talk about setting fires on purpose, just because it's pretty, because they enjoy the spectacle in the evening, things like that. They definitely had a different sense of fire than we do today.
Yeah, and in some locations, it's the easiest and most effective tool for clearing land for pasturage and stuff.
Oh, for sure. And even after cutting down trees, and then you would push all this all the scrub trees into piles, set fire to that, do it again, do it again, do it again. There was no way to avoid burning when you were trying to clear land, for sure. Yeah.
Mark Harvey asks, he says he may have missed your specific analysis of your point about Maine's state officials who were blamed for starting the fires there. What was appealing about them being seen as the culprits?
I think a kind of an anti-government bent, that there's a feeling that if we can find a specific human agent for this fire, we're going to latch onto that. And I think that there was something kind of desirable about that, especially if they're associated with government. That's really where I was going with that. And that really began right away. I mean, like, I'm doubtful, let's say, that John Neptune wrote that on his own, or at least transcribed it in the way that is reported in the newspaper. So it seems like right at the beginning in 1825, there's an interest in kind of stirring the pot and blaming the government for the setting of these fires. And as I said, between August and September, Neptune's newspaper report is in regard to the August and September fires, in which he says the state agents did so to blame, basically to turf out the indigenous people. But by October, that has changed, that people are saying in the newspapers that the fires are being set by the government to get rid of squatters, which in a way they are. I mean, they are setting fire to the hay, which squatters are going to be using to kind of power the whole enterprise. But certainly they're not setting major fires. There's no indication that they actually were setting major fires in hopes of getting rid of lumber poachers.
Yeah, if they were setting fires, they could certainly accidentally start a larger fire. Happens time and again. The other thing for folks to bear in mind is, I mean, we're only a half century removed from the American Revolution, which starts with a distrust of government. And so that thread, well, some things haven't changed much here in the United States, a distrust of government and government officials.
There's even actually a weirder connection to that, because somewhat unrelated to that, but not quite unrelated to that in 1825, some of the lumber squatters dress up as indigenous people and kind of throw their own Boston Tea Party to the land agents at that very moment, complaining about the fact that the government is trying to put a halt to their cutting activities.
Leighton Quarles asks if the fire complex or memories of it fed into efforts to institute fire protection on either side of the border in New Brunswick or in Maine.
That's a great question. I don't really see any of that. I would love to see examples from the like 1820s and 30s that people are treating fire differently. There's not really much evidence that they are because of the Miramichi fire. I mean, there are other things going on, like fire insurance is really developing across northeastern North America right at this point anyway. And whether or not that sped up the likelihood that people are going to buy fire insurance is difficult to say. But I would actually say that in terms of fire protection, that the Peshtigo fire, the fires of 1871, really kick off the idea of forest conservation in a way that the Miramichi fire doesn't in any way, shape, or form. So in a way, you could, and I think I do argue in the book, or at least mention in the book, suggest in the book that the Peshtigo fire probably had a much greater impact on forest conservation in New Brunswick and Maine than the 1825 fires did.
In that fire, the Peshtigo fire also coincides with the growing fear of a timber famine.
Yeah.
Whereas 1825, it's a continent the continent lays before them.
Absolutely.
It's just they don't know how much timber there is, and so I mean, even in the 1870s, there's still this attitude of we can keep cutting. It's an endless supply.
Yeah.
But there are those who are, well, George Perkins Marsh being one of them. 1864 is already sounding the alarm.
Mm-hmm.
So that certainly makes sense. James Farrell asks, do you know if there's much work published on the successional pathways or forest development post-fire? Major differences between the Maine forests and New Brunswick forests?
Differences. Quick answer, I guess I'd say, is no, I don't know of that. I mean, one of the things that I tried to trace, of course, is the successional history after these fires. What exactly happens after these fires, particularly in New Brunswick, because New Brunswick was my main focus, but also in Maine. And I mean, one of the things you find out quickly is that there's just no way to know, for example, what individual tree, what individual acre, what individual anything burns in 1825 versus 1826, for example. I mean, there's major fires throughout the region again in 1826 and in other years. So on the one hand, that makes it kind of impossible to know what exactly was the result of 1825. But again, like one of the, when I talk about how natural disasters kind of consolidate things, it's probably true too that land that burned in 1826 and other becomes consolidated into the 1825 fires in people's memory. They think, well, that's burnt land of basically this vintage, so they assume it must have happened in 1825.
And of course, they're not doing surveys, timber surveys like we think of today at that time, you know, documenting every tree species, et cetera, on the land. It's so from a data standpoint, it's vague, right?
Yeah, there's a, I mentioned that geographers have this term of the ecumene or ecumene, depending on who wants to pronounce it, about the kind of the populated, the well-settled area. And northern New Brunswick and northern New Brunswick and eastern Maine, northern Maine really, is some of one of the largest non-ecumene pocket within the general ecumene of North America. This is, and it has been for a long time. And as a result, like even 50 years after the fire in northern New Brunswick, white foresters, geologists, others were traveling up there, basically seeing this land for almost the first time, or at least surveying it for the first time, like a half century after, so late that there was absolutely no way of knowing what had burned in 1825. So I read a book about a fire in a place, but I'm not exactly sure where that place was.
Karen Bennett asks, well, actually, Karen, I'll come back to your question in a second. There's somebody anonymously asked if you know what the nature of the forest regeneration following the fire. What was the nature of forest regeneration? I mean, I know it's going to be natural. There's not deliberate reforestation efforts.
That's absolutely the case. There was no real there was no attempt to tree plant, if that's the question. But did it grow up? It certainly didn't grow up to be the same forest. I mean, that's what it comes down to, that a different forest grows up. In some places, I mean, in some pockets, basically it took a century for regeneration to occur. I mean, there were pockets where, and there's one I'm thinking of in particular, along a major route along eastern New Brunswick, where it burned down right to the soil and really did not regenerate. And so for the next century, this is what people looked at to be evidence of the permanent effects of the Miramichi fire, that there was an assumption that because this area right along the roadside did not regrow, then presumably this entire area of 1/5 of New Brunswick is never going to have the same forest it did. And I think that affected, I mean, what's clear is that at least in the short term, the fear that was going to be the case changed the demographics of New Brunswick. It meant that that people fled to other parts of the province to start timber operations elsewhere. But timber operations continued in the Miramichi as well, to the surprise of everyone, not everyone, but to the surprise of lots of people, to the surprise of people in the international relief effort who'd given tons of money and then found, wait, you're in a forest region, a forest economy, and your forest just burned down, and yet you're going to keep on forestry. Like, the idea was, well, obviously you must have exaggerated the forest fire. But that wasn't the case. I mean, it was just more the case that there were lots of trees still standing and lots of trees growing back up immediately after.
And not every tree burned.
No.
So to swing back to Karen's question. You mentioned that the American Red Cross disaster relief map starts with this fire, 1825. Did it include earlier fires? Is her question.
That one didn't, and I gotta say, most lists of historical forest fires start with the 1825 one. I mean, obviously there are forest fires pre-1825, but the Miramichi one has kind of a good moment, I guess, because it is both large enough but reported enough. Like it's in an area where lots of people can report it. People in the British North America, people in the United States, lots of newspapers, and that's really what generates I don't know what you call it, a critical mass, I guess, of information that allows it to be typically the first major forest fire mentioned in lists. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Donald Davis, who coincidentally is here at FHS doing research on his next book, and it has something to do with New England. And Don, that's all. I'm not going to show your hand. But he says there was a on your map, the 1948 map, it omits a fire that occurred in central Maine in 1795 that burned more than 200,000 acres.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you're, it's not your map, so we're not faulting you, of course. But if that fire, are there connections, like, or did you look at that fire in central Maine almost as a prelude to how people remembered fires in underpopulated areas?
I didn't. I can't remember off the top of my head if I knew of that fire at all. I mean, there were fires in New Brunswick that were talked about in the 1700s as well. The reason I guess I used that 48 map
48.
by Charles Foe is because it gives such a nice, distinct, coherent size of exactly where the Miramichi fire burned in Maine. I mean, people talk about the Maine, but people talk about the fire in Maine as being like there in the center of the map, but Foe really shows it visually in a way that was useful for my purposes. I didn't know about that 1790s map or fire, or I can't recall it at the moment. I can't say I really looked at previous fires to see how, certainly in the New Brunswick, I mean, from the new, one of the things I'm really stressing about it in the New Brunswick side, of course, is that nobody, with the obvious exception of the indigenous population, nobody was really there in the 1790s or the 1760s or whenever. That the people who were there in 1825 were kind of huddled on the edge of northeastern North America, and they just basically arrived there. I think one of my most fun findings from this was discovering that there'd been people, actually immigrant ships sailing over from Scotland, arrived in Miramichi, the entire place in flames. Then they go, maybe we'll go back. So they went back to Scotland and wrote about it in Scottish newspapers about the fire that had happened there.
Wow.
And their reports had never been noticed in 200 years in North America, but they'd written about them in these little newspapers in Scotland. But it wasn't exactly much of a welcome for immigrants, presumably. So maybe they were going to go back in 1826. Maybe they went the next year. I don't know. But they thought, let's give this a miss. We've all had vacations like that, right?
Yeah. Maybe we'll rebook our trip.
Yeah.
By the way, Karen Bennett also had asked if you knew the etymology of the Miramichi.
Where the word comes from.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of words in Eastern North America. It seems like it's an Aboriginal word of the Mi'kmaq that is being kind of bastardized, Baudelarized by Europeans. But it seems to be okay, I'm going to misrepresent this. I do talk about it in the book, but it's like the Mi'kmaq homeland, like the real heart of the Mi'kmaq homeland. That is one interpretation of what the word means.
Okay.
Okay.
Charles McClure asks, have there been any core data taken to determine a consistency of fire dates across the entire area? In other words, has there been any dendrological dating done?
I attempted it myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you'll have to have me come back and talk about that. With a forestry PhD student at the University of New Brunswick, I was basically looking to see if Ganong's map of the fire, which is very much focused on a small region around the Miramichi, if we could find evidence, considering that there have been good forest survey maps of all of New Brunswick, whether or not we could find evidence of older trees with fire scars from 1825 beyond Ganong's map. So we basically looked at rings kind of further out from what his core area was, and went looking for, first looking for older trees and looking for older trees that might have fire scars from 1825. And we did find, good news, bad news. The good news is that we found older trees than people expected us to find. That the forestry department, we found 300- and 400-year-old trees, which, considering how much of New Brunswick has been forested, or excuse me, has been lumbered over the last 2 centuries, is pretty remarkable. But we didn't find any fire scars. And in fact, we kind of realized during the project just how quixotic, I guess is the word, the hope was of finding such trees, because we were looking for trees that basically, let's see, were old enough to, let's say they were born in at least the 1790s, old enough to have survived the fire, but first, of course, had to be alive during the fire, had to have been burnt by the fire, had to leave a scar on the fire, have to have survived, and then survived for the next 2 centuries. We didn't find any, but it was a fun project to do anyway.
Skylar asks, in your research, what, if anything, did you learn about the role of,
The role of oops. Yes, an excellent question.
If you learned about the role of indigenous communities, such as the Abenaki and the Wabanaki, in fire management before the 1825 fire.
Right. I got to say that I am not very satisfied, and I'm sure others will not be satisfied with the amount of with my treatment, or let's say the extent of my treatment of indigenous fire or indigenous people around this fire. The Mi'kmaq, for example, in New Brunswick, there's not really much evidence that they set fire for purposes. There's actually not a lot of evidence of fire management, from what I know, throughout northeastern North America, either on the Maine side or the New Brunswick side. But one of the things, and this is kind of a, I mean, one of the things you do, I think, in writing a book is you try to write everything you can, and also maybe piss people off sufficiently that they write their own material or they improve on your book. And I do think I contacted Mi'kmaq communities in New Brunswick. I tried to find resources that I could from the early 19th century. One of the things that I really argue, but the point is that I would say largely unsuccessful, but I would welcome others to do that. One of the things that I will say is that this book became kind of a book about digital history, about the fact that the way we can find things now in a way that we couldn't have before, even around 2000. So even, for example, that example I gave of the Scottish newspapers, I could find those in a way that nobody had in the previous 2 centuries, because I could keyword the word Miramichi into UK databases. that really helps in finding things that have been written down, but it doesn't help with material. For example, indigenous people living in northern Maine or northern New Brunswick, that doesn't help very much at all. In fact, you could say that the amount of textual material further obscures topics that have already been obscured.
It speaks to the pros and cons of the oral tradition.
Yep.
As well. Robert Sherwood asks, is there a difference between the reactions in the two locations due to one being a colony and one being a state? Specifically, did the state of Maine allow the fact that it is a state allow for a quicker response than the colonial government of New Brunswick?
That might seem to make sense, but I don't really think it is the case. I don't think, because of the nature of the damage in Maine versus New Brunswick, I think that the reaction of the governments were just different. And I do think that even though it was a colony, not a state, I mean, in a way, I mean, that one might argue even that gave New Brunswickers and Miramichiers greater kind of access to imperial government than Maine might have had to the national government. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is that in 1825, the Miramichi specifically, not just New Brunswick, Miramichi was the #1 source of timber for Great Britain. Just in that very year, it was short-lived, but they've been really peaking in the early 1820s, and that ends in 1825 after the fire. It goes down after that. But what happened in Miramichi was economically, in terms of the forest industry, is really watched over in Great Britain with delay, because it takes a while for information to travel across. Right. But I don't really see much difference in response because of colony versus state, in answer to the question.
It's also the era very much of small government.
Mm-hmm.
State governments and federal governments, just the sense of federal aid or even state aid,
right,
just isn't what it is today.
Right.
Andrew Stillman notes that the fire spurred an exodus of settlers from New Brunswick they dispersed to the US or to Upper Canada. Was there also an exodus of folks from Maine to other parts of Maine, or is there's just a general exodus because of this fire?
I don't think in Maine there's much evidence of an exodus from the settled communities. I mean, one of the things the reasons it's difficult to track this is because so many working in northern Maine and working in northeastern and New Brunswick were like migrant laborers, essentially. It's not like they were well settled there, and it was easy for them to go elsewhere, or to go wherever the trees were, wherever the trees were being cut down. Mm-hmm. So the population there was in New Brunswick, for example, in Miramichi, it was a settled community, but there was also probably maybe 5 times that, a group of men who were coming from the US, who were coming from Quebec, who were coming from the other maritime colonies, who were much more mobile, but also more, what would you say, easy to lose. And that makes another reason why it's hard to know how many died in the Miramichi, because the initial reports were of entire groups of dozens of timber crews, dozens of members of a single timber crew wiped out. Very difficult to know exactly how many people died.
Yeah, the records would be spotty at best for these timber crews.
Yeah.
I want to thank Karen Bennett for pointing out that the New England Fire Compact, or modern day efforts, started in 1947, or started with fires in 1947 in Maine and New Hampshire, touching on an earlier point. And also, thanks to the anonymous person who points out the American Red Cross wasn't founded until the 1880s, but they were, I think this ties back to the that map that they created. I mean, it's just, I think that map is just documenting relief efforts.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that is a 21st century map of historic forest fires. Like basically, somewhere in the American Red Cross, they decided that they were going to map floods, famous historical floods, and they did that, and famous historical earthquakes. And the only reason I point this out, not to connect this fire with the American Red Cross in any way, other than the map that they made to where they thought it happened.
Yeah.
Or maybe where one person in the American Red Cross, maybe I shouldn't play the American Red Cross on Larry for that. So.
Stuart Moskowitz asks if you were able to determine or how far the impact of smoke or how far the smoke drifted and how widespread it might have been. I guess it's going to depend on prevailing winds, but were there reports of it in, he asks, Boston or New York or farther east, maybe out to sea, or
yeah, absolutely.
What, if anything, did you find?
I found certainly, I mean, the most, there were reports saying as far as south as Bermuda, but the farthest south I could find where more of an actual like described report of it was Washington, D.C., but certainly the entire northeast of North America was covered in smoke for days. And really bizarre smoke effects that had not been seen before, or at least not remembered before. Ferries were closed. I think across the Potomac, that the ferry across the Potomac was closed because there was too much smoke. I looked for evidence of smoke, in Great Britain, because we know from forest fires, for example, in Alberta, that's in Canada, have burned, the smoke has gone all the way to Europe. I looked for evidence of that. I found a purple haze around southern England around the 15th or so of October of that year, but whether or not it connects up with that or not, no, it doesn't seem evidence of a lot of talk about smoke or haze in the UK, but certainly there was lots of talk about smoke for days in northeastern North America. Yeah.
Be curious if anyone can create a map of the winds. The fact that it reaches down to Washington when these were there fires also at that time? So we're as far west as Montreal. Were there fires reported in like western upstate New York?
Upstate New York, I can't remember if I saw it there, but I mean, honestly, when you go looking, you start seeing, and I mean, the problem then is you start seeing smoke everywhere and fire everywhere, but there were definitely, there were forest fires that year on the west bank of Lake Michigan. There's a quite well-known painting of the Mackenzie River in northwestern Canada on fire, or the forest by the Mackenzie River on fire in 1825. There were fires a lot of places in North America in the fall of 1825. And again, I tie that back to hot year after a number of cold years. It was good conditions for forest fires.
Okay. I want to point out that in the chat, Maddie Eberly points to an article on, it's entitled Oak Forests and Woodlands as Indigenous Landscapes in the Eastern United States. And this draws on the field, from the field of paleoecology. We'll pass that along for folks that are interested in that aspect of this story, the indigenous perspective and involvement. So thanks to Maddie for pointing that out. Thanks to Karen Bennett for also providing information. This is the joy of the webinar. is this interaction. But most importantly, Alan, thank you for this great presentation. Really enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
Jamie.